I've already done all of my announcements, but my last one is going to be to actually introduce Katie, who is being wonderful and adjusting to technical issues that we can't figure out. So Katie Scholes is the Outreach and Training Coordinator at the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, with a background that includes work in healthcare, public health, marketing, communication, and social services fields. Her multidisciplinary background provides unique perspectives needed to understand the complexities and nuances of domestic violence, especially in rural areas. Katie's expertise lies in community engagement, training development and implementation, and trauma-informed care. She comes with a wealth of experience across various disciplines, working with individuals from diverse backgrounds, ages, and lived experiences. So we thank Katie for being here and being adjustable. And I've got your presentation pulled up, Katie, and hopefully you can see that. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm just pulling up the one that I sent to you so that my slides match yours. So as I find those, I've only done a few trainings this month. There we go. So as we jump in, I'm Katie Scholes. I'm the Outreach and Training Coordinator for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I've been in this position for about 1.5 years, but as Teresa explained, I have a lot of experience in different areas and different fields. Other fun facts, fun things about me, aside from having technical difficulties, I also have a fun little hobby farm. I have 3 boys, and we like to hang out outside. So that's just a little bit about me before we jump in. This next slide is our grant support slide. This is just saying that I am a grant-funded position. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this training are mine and not necessarily those of OVW. So yeah. So jumping right in, we have what is domestic violence. And so I'm a pretty informal presenter. I should have said that at the beginning. So feel free to type in the chat, shout out, things that way. I can't see the chat, but Teresa's really great and she'll make sure that, that I can hear those. So jumping in, what is domestic violence? And we have our state statute for that. So under Utah Code 77-36-1, we have domestic violence or domestic violence offense means any criminal offense involving violence or physical harm, or a threat of violence or physical harm, or any attempt, conspiracy, or solicitation to commit a criminal offense involving violence or physical harm when committed by one cohabitant against another. Domestic violence or domestic violence offense includes commission or attempt to commit any of the following offenses by one cohabitant against another. And then we go into, a long list of offenses that range from simple assault, aggravated assault. It also includes mayhem, harassment, things of that nature. But what is domestic violence? We know that it's more than just that physical harm that's highlighted here in the statute. And domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one person to maintain power and control over another person. So some of those examples are going to include physical abuse, like the statute says, but it's also going to include emotional or verbal abuse, sexual coercion, financial abuse, digital abuse, and stalking. Those are a few examples of domestic violence. On our next slide, we have what is intimate partner violence, or IPV. And IPV only occurs between romantic partners who may or may not be living in the same household together. IPV is a subset of domestic violence. So domestic violence is that overarching term that we hear or that we use. And then under that, we have separate subsets. So that can be intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, things of that nature. And so with intimate partner violence, the examples are the same. We have that physical abuse, emotional, verbal, sexual, financial abuse, digital abuse, and stalking. As we get into this, I don't think the power and control wheel is included on the slides that Teresa is sharing, but we have a power and control wheel we'll talk about later, and we can kind of cover that there. But when we're working with individuals who are experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence, it's really important that we're meeting someone where they are. And there's a lot of different ways to look at that, but this quote here is my favorite one. Meeting someone where they are means that we're bridging the gap between your own expectations and where the other person is actually coming from. That means intentionally listening to understand their values, needs, desires, and even their trauma responses. So it's not about us. It doesn't include us. We're not part of that equation. We're going to remove ourselves, check ourselves at the door, and look at their values, their needs, their desires, their trauma responses. And sometimes that's really hard to do, but when we don't do that, that could be a sign that we are flexing power. And flexing power is when you are perceived by an individual to have power over them and or others, and you're using that power or that perception of power to make decisions for a survivor regardless of what they feel is best. So it's really important that we are avoiding policies and procedures that are flexing power. And Teresa, I am going to, I just realized that this has buttons in it that I don't think work in that PDF version. So I'm going to share that with you really quickly.
Okay, I'll look for it in my email.
Perfect. We're getting to that point. But it's really important that we're avoiding policies and procedures that flex power. And so really quickly, can you tell me if you are seeing the power and control wheel with a black background or a white background?
There is like a black, purpley background, yeah.
Perfect. So here we have the power and control wheel. I'm sure quite a few of you are already aware of what a power and control wheel is. So we have power and control at the center. We have our 8 spokes of different types and tactics of violence that offenders will use when they are committing acts of violence or domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And then as we get further out on that power and control wheel, we have that sexual and physical violence component. Very rarely we're seeing that domestic violence is starting on that outer sphere with the physical and sexual violence. Generally in these relationships, they're starting with other tactics like intimidation, isolation, privilege, children, things of that nature, before we get further out in that sphere to that physical violence and sexual violence. On that next slide, you should see a white background now with text inside those spokes. And on this power and control wheel is speaking specifically to flexing power. And so in each of those spokes, you can see different types and tactics that we're using within our systems, within our policies, our procedures, things of that nature, the way we are working with individuals that are flexes of power. So under intimidation, you can see that a flex of power there could be constant surveillance by staff, involuntary alcohol and drug treatments, forced treatments, things of that nature. If we go to minimizing, denying, and blaming, we can see accusing survivors of working the system, punishing certain coping mechanisms and survival skills, and then overlooking the presence of additional barriers. If we look at privilege, we can see staff does not reflect the population. We have biases in our shelter rules, lack of culturally appropriate food, supplies, or services, the power of service providers over survivors unexamined. Emotional abuse, we have that pretense of safety being used manipulatively, forced self-disclosure and public humiliation, questioning survivors' intelligence and abilities. So these could all be or are all policies or procedures that are flexing power over those that we are serving. Do you have any questions here?
There are no questions in the chat.
Perfect. Also, I used to do youth groups. I'm really, really comfortable with like the silence. So sometimes I can be a little awkward about that. As we move forward, we should have a flexing power example 1. So I'm going to read you this example, and keep in mind that these examples are designed to look at flexes of power that may occur within a system-based or a community-based advocate setting. But what's really important today is just looking at these examples and understanding where the flexes of power occur, how we feel about them, and different ways that we can navigate this so that we can understand and identify when those flexes of power are occurring in different settings. So here we have a system-based advocate. Jane's meeting with a system-based advocate, and she states that she does not want to pursue a protective order against John. The advocate informs her that a protective order will offer additional safety, is the only way to keep her safe, and that if she doesn't request a protective order herself, the prosecution will. So Jane agrees to file for a protective order. How are we feeling about that?
As a reminder, you are able to unmute yourself or provide a response in the chat. In the chat, we have seems coerced, or it seems like she doesn't really have a choice, even though it's presented like she does. Another person asks, can the advocate actually impose that? Another, that's super coercive.
Yeah, and this might be a real life situation because prosecutors, they work for the community at large. So if they're seeing multiple high risk factors that are going to increase Jane's risk of lethality, they may request a protective order anyways. But there are a lot of reasons why Jane may not want one. So it's really important to look at those as well. Just to answer that question that came up in the chat, is this something that can happen? It is. This is a flex of power though, because our response is not going great, right? So a few considerations here. What if Jane has children and they're not John's? What if Jane has children with Joe? That may be a reason why Jane doesn't want to file for a protective order. Because if Jane files for a protective order, lists her children in them, and Joe is the father, we're going to have to notify Joe. So if Joe wants to go back to family court, look at custody, things that way, now Joe can come in and say, well, she can't keep my children safe, they're exposed to domestic violence, and those are valid concerns for Joe as well. So that's one consideration for this example. The other one I mentioned is the prosecutors, they do work for the community at large, not necessarily for that survivor. So they may be requesting a protective order anyways. Like I said, if they're seeing a lot of those high risk factors especially. But what they can do and what we can do if we were an advocate in this situation is just let them know and be transparent about that. We can also let Jane know that she can still go to the hearing. She can still speak at this hearing and let the judge know why she doesn't want a protective order, that she doesn't want a protective order. She can still be heard, and we can empower Jane in that way. We can give her voice back in that way so that she can be heard and she can voice her needs, her concerns. So it's about Jane there. That's how we're going to meet Jane where she is. Do you have any questions about this scenario? Any comments?
There is nothing coming in the chat.
Awesome. So we'll go to our next example. This example is a community-based scenario, and we have Jay, who uses they, them pronouns. Jay is a non-binary survivor that's currently in shelter. Jay is continuously staying out late with friends and family and is not returning until after midnight most nights. Staff worries about their safety but doesn't want to impose a curfew. Jay also struggles to maintain a clean environment and has been known to use substances to cope in the past. One night, Jay returns late and smells of alcohol. Shelter staff threaten to exit Jay if they continue to participate in unfavorable behaviors. How are we feeling about this one?
Okay, I'm just going to speak right up. I feel like the key word here is threaten. I feel like it's perfectly reasonable to talk to Jay about the shelter requirements and the rules and, and let Jay know in order to be in shelter, then the rules need to be followed. I think threatening Jay is the issue here. What we need to do is empower Jay to make the right decisions and not threaten.
Yeah, I really like that response. Thank you. Do we have any others?
We have a couple of them here in the chat. The difficulty for one person is them coming back to the shelter with alcohol in their breath. Another, as they're in shelter, they probably have shelter rules for the safety of others. Another person, is there a 3 strikes rule? Because maybe instead of kicking them out right away, give them some help and support so it doesn't happen again. Another person, I know many shelters have rules around substance use and believe they exist for a reason. Perhaps that could be discussed. Rather than threatening, staff should have approached it differently. They could have had a conversation about rules and timing was not correct. Be proactive, not reactive. And then another person, the example does not note if there are rules around alcohol. And then the last one that I'll read is from a harm reduction perspective, it would be helpful to address the concerns, but to also put the need for next steps to be guided by Jay regarding substance use and potential resources.
Yeah, some really great considerations, thoughts happening in the chat. It sounds like, thank you all for putting those in there and voicing those. One thing I want to point out is it says that Jay smells of alcohol, not necessarily that it's on their breath. So we don't know the context of that. The other thing is a few considerations for this one specifically, because we do want to keep everyone safe that's in shelter. We don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. Shelter is already hard enough as it is. But if we're going to exit Jay, is that going to alleviate any of our worry about them and their safety? Probably not. Some other considerations, if Jay is staying out late and coming back smelling of alcohol, Jay may be a bartender. That doesn't mean Jay is participating in drinking alcohol. That may just be an assumption that we have because they're staying out late and they're coming back smelling of alcohol. If they're staying out late, it says they're staying out late with friends and family. That means they have a support system. They have people who care about them. They have people who are going to help them in this very difficult part of their life. So I wouldn't necessarily look at that as a bad thing. Here, I feel like what we can do is have more of just a conversation with Jay. Let them know our concerns and why we have them. But it doesn't have to lead to threatening to exit or impose curfews or things of that nature. Addressing the substance use, if Jay has been known to abuse substances in the past, maybe that's another conversation that we have, like, hey, are you utilizing substances? But keep in mind that this is a coping skill that a lot of people have. but to what extent is it at this point? They actually may not be using alcohol at all. They may be having a drink every night. We don't know the extent of that here. So again, a one-on-one conversation where we're really being compassionate and showing empathy to Jay and what they're going through, because it's a lot. That's a lot for them. Sometimes I have people pointing out like the clean environment. One thing to consider there is that a clean environment to me may not be a clean environment to Teresa or to any of you on the call today. We may have different perspectives of what clean is. It's like when you tell your kids to help you and do the dishes and then they load the dishwasher wrong, or your partner, they load the dishwasher wrong too, but they did it. So there's just varying levels of what's clean and what's the correct way to clean and things that way as well. And all of these are able to be addressed through a conversation without all of those flexes of power. The other question here that I generally look at is Jay causing harm to anyone in shelter? Is there anyone who feels like Jay is causing harm?
There isn't anything. Oh, yeah. Somebody says no harm. Another comment is maybe ask them if they feel safe, because maybe that's part of this. Before threatening them, no, not all at this time. And that's all.
Thank you. Yeah, so if Jay's not causing harm, they're participating in unfavorable behaviors that the staff is deeming unfavorable. But if we exit Jay, then what message is that sending? What would that feel like if you heard that Jay had been exited and this was the scenario that they presented?
One comment in the chat says it could be alarming to some residents if they get in so late.
Yeah, absolutely. If I pick up a night shift and I come back late, I'm also going to be exited.
And then it's a scare
If I go out with,
residents.
yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I did hear scare tactic. Absolutely. So if I go out with my friends and I have a drink, am I also going to be exited? Is this a safe space for folks who are LGBTQIA? Jay's a non-binary survivor. So different things to consider here on this example. But with all of that to say, I recognize that it's not as black and white as we would like it to be. There's a whole lot of gray here, and that it is very challenging to work with survivors. So what characteristics or behaviors are victims presenting with that make it challenging to work with them? When we're working with victims or survivors, what makes that work challenging? What behaviors are they presenting with that make it challenging to work with them? And if you don't work specifically with victims or survivors, what behaviors would you think would make it hard to work with them?
One in the chat is high levels of anxiety or hypervigilance or withdrawal. They have traumatic experiences that make them hypervigilant or anxious, learned helplessness, trauma responses like fear and isolation, guilt, blame, PTSD, resistance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how often are you running into that?
This person added that they don't follow through and it's repeated. It's frequently, daily, all the time, very often.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go to this next slide, oftentimes this is what we're seeing. We're seeing these counterproductive or these destructive behaviors that victims or survivors are showing us. But on the next slide, it's really important that we take that step back and try to understand to the best of our ability that bigger picture of what they're actually going through. They're dealing with a lot. There's a lot going on, and we can't and won't ever see or understand the full extent of that, but it's really important for us to take that step back and do our best to understand the big picture. With that said, someone brought up trauma responses, and there are 4 main ways that we're reacting to fear and trauma. Most people are familiar with that fight, flight, or freeze. So generally, I talk about the fawn more, and that fawn reaction is that trauma bonding, that codependency. I generally talk about myself on this slide because it's really easy for me to explain this in that way rather than trying to make a list of different ways that they're responding. But if you would have met me 15 years ago, my trauma response was definitely fawn. I was going to do whatever it took for you to not be mad at me. Please don't be mad at me. I don't care how hard the task is, how invasive it is, how difficult it is, how long it's going to take me to do it. I'm going to do it so that you are not mad at me. I also was not really great at making my own decisions. I needed someone else to affirm that that was the correct decision. So that's that fawn trauma response. But over time, we know that our trauma responses change, and not only do they change over time, but they're going to change from situation to situation, from person to person. I react differently with my parents than I'm going to do with a stranger. I'm going to react differently with my children than I am with my parents or my cousins or my siblings. But also, situation to situation, those trauma responses are going to change as well. And so if you know me in person now, my trauma response is very much fight. Like, we can throw hands if you want to, like we can fight about it, but don't try to actually fight me because I know you can't see me right now, but I'm only 5 feet tall. I only weigh like 120 pounds. So like, I'm not a big human being, but my trauma response is to fight. So over time, those trauma responses are going to change. That's not something that we can necessarily control. But we do have those trauma responses, so it's really important to be able to recognize those when those are happening. So if we think back to those scenarios with Jane, who was told to file for a protective order, we're going to file for one anyways. What trauma response may we have seen there?
I just scrolled up to Jane's example so folks can have that in their head too. In the chat, they said flight.
Yeah, flight could definitely be one that we're seeing with Jane.
Also fawn.
Absolutely. I can see where both of those could come in. And what about for Jay? What trauma responses may we see there?
In the chat, we have a couple flight.
Yeah, absolutely. I also see a little bit of fight here, because if we're looking at flight more in depth, fight comes with that force, that flout, that refuse. And so I can see that flout there under fight. So J, ignoring like the rules or the expectations of the shelter if there's already like a curfew rule, which in itself is a flex of power. But ignoring those rules, those expectations that were or weren't set, I can see that there. But I also see the flight in Jay's scenario as well, especially through that like fantasize, that escapism lens. As we continue through, it's really important that we're keeping the need of survivors to feel safe, or of any of our clients or people that we're working with. It's really important that we keep their need to feel safe forefront in our mind. So that's where that trauma-informed care piece comes in. It's really important to make sure that they feel safe with you, safe to make mistakes, safe to feel negatively, safe to be themselves, safe to be honest and open, and safe to make the final decisions. And keep in mind that there is a very big difference between being physically safe and being emotionally safe or spiritually safe or being culturally safe. An example that I like to give is I spoke at a law enforcement conference a while back, and I presented, did great, did not get a lot of audience engagement. The resting cop face, it's real. I love my law enforcement partners, they're great, but they do have some resting cop face from time to time. And so at the end of my presentation, I came off of the stage and I texted my supervisor and I said, every single person in this room hates me, because that's how it felt. So I didn't necessarily feel safe to make a mistake, safe to feel negatively about that, safe to make, the final decisions, feel honest and open. If I were a survivor in that moment, I would not have felt safe to do those things. So I texted my supervisor and I said, every single person in this room hates me. But at the end of the presentation, I had a QR code, they scanned it, and it was for them to give feedback on my presentation and how they felt. They gave me all 4- and 5-star reviews. They thought it was great. Actually, when law enforcement came up and presented later in the conference, they quoted me, talked about how wonderful my presentation was. They chatted with me in the hall during breaks, during lunch, and they really loved it. But they didn't feel that way in the moment. So there's a very big difference between being physically safe and being emotionally safe, or spiritually safe or culturally safe in other regard other than physical. Because I was probably the most physically safe person in that room that day, but I didn't feel safe in other regards. So it's really, really important that we keep their need to feel safe forefront in our mind and feel safe in more than just physically safe. So all of that to say, how can we understand the bigger picture that survivors are facing? And Teresa, if you have not switched over to that Google PowerPoint, the Google Slides, I would do that now.
I am on the Google PowerPoint, so we are good to go.
Perfect. So how can we understand that bigger picture that survivors are facing? So it's really important that we're understanding that bigger picture. Are we setting expectations of the justice system, and what are our own expectations of the justice system? Because what my own expectations are, that bias that I already have there, may limit the way that I'm able to set those expectations. And when I'm saying set expectations of the justice system, I'm not trying to set expectations of this is what's going to happen. These are the results that we're looking for, things of that nature. That's not necessarily what I'm speaking to, but more of like, you're going to come in, this is what the room looks like, here's the way it's going to be set up, here's what I can and can't do to support you, things of that nature, specifically for advocates, law enforcement, things of that nature. But whatever your involvement is, how can we set those expectations for them? And also keep in mind that they're reliving these acts of violence all the time, every day. They have to tell their friends, their neighbors, their family. And the court of public opinion is generally a lot harsher than the criminal justice system. But they're reliving these acts of violence. They're missing work to attend these court hearings if they've even decided to if they've even chosen to participate in the criminal justice system. Man, words are hard sometimes. But they're missing work. They have to find sitters if they have children. There's a lot going on there. And they are constantly having reminders of where they are and what they're trying to overcome. So on this next slide, we should have our pretty flow chart, starting with the lethality assessment. The lethality assessment was mandated last July. And so anytime law enforcement is called out to the scene of an intimate partner violence call, dispute, they're going to administer a lethality assessment. And then they're going to connect survivors on scene to services. Keep in mind that for this flow chart, there is not a right or a wrong way to go through this. And they don't have to follow this flow chart exactly. All of these little bubbles can be interconnected at some point in their journey through services. But for today's sake, for the purpose of this activity, we are going to go down one of these slides, and I followed the traditional thought process of if she leaves or if she stays. So we're going to start with that lethality assessment. We know a lethality assessment has been conducted. And then we're going to say that for today, that was conducted on scene with law enforcement, and they're going to try to connect her to services. So we make the phone call, and they're going to safety plan with that survivor, and they're going to ask if they would like to come into shelter or participate in other services. And so would it be more helpful to go down the engage in services side or that decline services?
There should be a poll on everybody's screen, and we'll explore each of these scenarios further. So whichever one you have interest in, go ahead and click engaging in services or declining services. Ooh, it's a battle. Looks like most folks are interested in when they decline services. It's a 60-40
Okay.
split though.
Very close. If we have time, we can come back around too.
Okay.
So if you click on the little decline services button, did that work for you?
Yep.
Awesome. So when they are declining services, a few things to consider. Keep in mind that referral was still made. So if they were not aware of the services that were available to them, that are available to them, they are now. They know that there are services available to them. They know how to access them. They know where they are. They have that information now. Keep in mind that it may not be safe for them to leave right now. We know that oftentimes when survivors are leaving, that increases their lethality, risk for lethality by 500, 700%, depending on what those risk factors are in their relationship. So it may not be safe for them to leave right now. They also may not have the means to leave right now, because if we look back to that power and control wheel, think back to that power and control wheel, they may be isolated and they may be experiencing economic abuse, so if they don't have friends or family nearby, they may be several hours away or states away, counties away, things of that nature. So they may not have the means to leave because family can't be here in the next 20, 30 minutes, sometimes even the next 12 to 24 hours. So they may not have the means to leave as far as that goes, but also economically, if they have experienced isolation and economic abuse to the point that they don't have a job and they don't have access to a bank account, they may not have any financial means to leave either. And leaving may not be best for them or the family. There are different risk levels when we are looking at these relationships. And if they aren't seeing a lot of those high risk factors that are going to increase their risk of lethality to that 500% or 700% degree, leaving may not be best for them. There are also people out there who truly love the offender may truly love the victim may truly love the offender. But for them, this might just be a Tuesday and they don't recognize the violence either. So leaving for them may not be best for them or the family at this time. There are other things that we can connect them to, though. There are offender treatment options and things of that nature. And if they're engaging in offender treatment, if the offender is engaging in offender treatment, it's really, really important that we are aligning their level of risk to the treatment that they are receiving. So we don't want to put a lower risk offender in a high risk group or vice versa. And keep in mind, they may already be engaged in services too. They may have called the hotline last week and got connected with services, but in the violence and the trauma that's currently happening, they may have forgotten that they have a case management appointment tomorrow. That's not something that they have to disclose to anyone, and that's not something that our community-based agencies can disclose because of the level of confidentiality that they have. But they may already be engaged in services, and we just may not know that. So just a few considerations for when they are declining services. Do you have any questions on this slide? Okay. If we go back to that flow chart, we have the lethality assessment. They've been connected to services, but they declined them. They declined that engagement with services. So now we have they stay with the partner or they're going to stay elsewhere, such as with a family member, at a hotel, things of that nature. Which would we like to look at now?
All right. Looks like we're leaning towards stays with partner. It's 76-24. 73-27.
When they're staying with the partner, it's really important to, first of all, recognize that intimate partner violence is a tangled web of fear, love, and hope, and that the choices survivors make are emotional and complex and never straightforward. So when they're staying with the partner, what we're going to do is we're going to safety plan. That's already happened on the phone with the advocate, as long as they've been connected on scene and been able to have that choice and be able to make that decision to decline services. So we're going to safety plan with the survivor. A few things to do is, or a few things not to do, sorry, terrible verbiage on my part. But oftentimes what the safety plan is going to look like is something like keeping your devices charged, keeping an exit available to them, especially in moments where they can feel that tension increasing. Alert someone if they're able to or feel safe and comfortable doing so, such as a neighbor, friend, family member, like, hey, can you check on me? If you hear something, could you call, report that, things of that nature. We're also going to tell them to keep the lights on outside in case law enforcement needs to return. It's easier for them to find the address on their house if they have one there, and see what's happening, especially if it's at night, the middle of the night. If needed or relevant, we're going to update emergency contacts, things of that nature, what that safety plan can look like. We're not going to show frustration if we return to the address. If we see them utilizing services repeatedly, things like that, we're not going to show frustration. So keep in mind that on average, it's taking 7 attempts to leave the relationship, but the acts of violence that these survivors are experiencing are much, much higher. So on average, it takes 7 attempts to leave. So if we're returning to that address or we are re-engaging with the survivor multiple times, don't show your frustration with that. I know that that can be very frustrating, but that's not something we're going to show the survivor. We're going to leave that frustration and check ourselves at the door. We're going to reassess upon their return, and we're going to do that continually. We want to be supportive of the survivor, because the second that they know that we're frustrated with them, we think they're working the system, things like that, we can be further isolating them from accessing services ever again, and that can be extremely dangerous for a survivor who is trying to leave. If they don't feel like they can trust you or engage in your services, that can be very dangerous. Life-threatening, actually. So we want to make sure that we are being supportive of the survivor and know that they are coming from a space of expertise on their own relationship, their own life, and their own safety. They're really good at the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn because that's how they stay alive. They're really great at making those decisions that are going to keep them alive, and this may be one of them. But by supporting the survivor and their decisions and truly listening to them and meeting them where they are, you're going to be building trust, showing empathy, and this is going to in turn facilitate future help seeking from the survivor when they're ready and able to access those services again. Do you have any questions here on this slide?
There's nothing in the chat.
Okay, thank you. We've had that lethality assessment conducted on scene. We've connected them to the hotline. They've declined services and chose to stay with their partner. Would it be more helpful to look at counseling or lethality assessment?
We're leaning towards another lethality assessment.
Okay. So if we are looking at another lethality assessment, first of all, how many people are familiar with a lethality assessment?
Go ahead and put it in the chat. I don't have a poll for that one.
Sorry,
No, you're good. We
I'm
have
at rogue there.
we have several folks saying they're not very, and then a couple that are like, yeah, I do. But most, I would say, are either they don't know or have just a very general understanding.
Okay, so the lethality assessment is used to assess risk of lethality for the victim. It's not validated to predict offender behavior. So the lethality here in Utah is completed on scene by law enforcement officers only when the predominant aggressor has been determined for an intimate partner violence call out. It's not designed to be used during the criminal justice process, but here in Utah, we have changed that to the Utah Intimate Partner Violence Lethality Assessment. And so, because we are using that as an investigative tool on scene. The lethality assessment is used to connect victims to services and helps identify victims at the highest risk of lethality, and it can expedite access to services because they are making that call on scene right after the act of violence. It's really important to know that lethality assessments are based in the victim's perception and not based in an accredited evaluation or found through investigation. This is a tool that we use that shouldn't be used for offender accountability, as it's not always a validated description of offender behavior. Again, it's coming from the perception of the victim and no other source. If you have questions about the lethality assessment or you want to learn more about that, I can send over a link for that, or you can also connect with McKaylee. She is my coworker. She runs our prevention program. She does really great trainings on the lethality assessment. She does refresher trainings and things of that nature all the time. But I just wanted to do a brief overview of the lethality assessment and what that is before we jump into this slide. So the lethality assessment, again, conducted on scene. There are also some of our service providers, our advocates that are able to conduct that lethality assessment as well. But it's really important that we're being consistent with survivors, whether it's the first, second, third, or the 47th time that you've conducted a lethality assessment on this survivor in the same IPV relationship, we have to be consistent. We're going to treat it as if it's the first time you've conducted an assessment on them, and we're going to show them the same concern, compassion, and empathy that we did the first time we did that. As a reminder, those are going to be conducted every time there's IPV, regardless of whether there's physical injury or physical violence that's present. On the lethality assessment, most of the questions on there to understand the level of risk for lethality, most of them are not physical violence questions. There's questions around strangulation, but the rest of those are asking about like jealousy and things of that nature. So those are not physical violent acts, but they do increase their risk of lethality. So whether there's physical violence on scene or not, we're still going to do that, to ask those questions. And if we are doing multiple lethality assessments on the survivor over the course of time, that's only going to help us evolve that safety plan. And it's going to help the survivor understand their risk of lethality so that they can make the most informed decision. We're also going to support the survivor and remember that they're coming from a space of expertise on their own relationship, life, and safety. And by supporting the survivor and their decisions and truly listening to them, again, we are building that trust, showing empathy, and this can in turn facilitate that future help seeking. Their answers may change, and that's okay because we're still going to refer them to services. They may change from assessment to assessment as new information comes available, as the relationship develops, as the offender is switching tactics because one isn't working and this one is. So just keep in mind that those answers on the assessment may change. And we want to make sure that we're informing the survivor every time how these questions are going to be used. So if we're a law enforcement officer who is conducting the lethality assessment, we need to let them know that their answers will be discoverable in the criminal justice process. But regardless of who's doing this assessment, we need to be transparent and let survivors know what we are going to do with their answers. These are very vulnerable questions that we're asking that put survivors at greater risk sometimes because of that vulnerability and what they're disclosing. So we really need to be clear and transparent on how we're going to use these answers and if they can become discoverable or not throughout the criminal justice process and things of that nature. Do we have any questions here on the lethality assessment?
Katie, I have a question.
Love it.
I do not provide direct services for individuals, but I'm wondering, is the lethality assessment finding shared with any service providers in any capacity to help them like better understand the person coming to them?
Yeah, so when they are being connected to services on scene, generally a law enforcement officer is going to call in and chat with that hotline advocate first, let them know that they were called out to the scene of an IPV incident. They determined that predominant aggressor. They conducted the lethality assessment with the survivor on scene and that they scored high risk or other risk because all domestic violence and intimate partner violence is dangerous. So we're never going to call it low risk. So they're either high risk or other risk. And then we're going to let them know what questions they said yes or no to, any context to those questions, things of that nature. The lethality assessment also gives the option for the person conducting the lethality assessment to be able to increase that score from other risk to high risk based on that gut feeling, that intuition that we have. So if they scored by the scoring system on the lethality assessment, if they scored other risk, the law enforcement officer or the person conducting the lethality assessment, they can increase that score to high risk based off of what they have gathered on scene or things that way. So they're going to let the advocate know on the phone, and then they're going to hand that phone over to the survivor and let them chat with the hotline advocate one-on-one.
Okay. So that's
the lethality assessment will also be entered into the database that law enforcement is using, and that's also going to be sent to a service provider.
So that's only going then to advocates, not to, and like the system-based advocate or the community-based advocates themselves, and
Correct.
not to like healthcare workers or anything.
Right. Healthcare workers generally are going to use a similar assessment called the danger assessment.
Okay.
And that one involves like a calendar and things of that nature.
We have another question in the chat. This person doesn't directly work in this area, so just to clarify, they're asking if someone arrives on scene and both partners have been violent with each other, do they give the assessment to both?
No. The lethality assessment is only conducted if we are able to determine the predominant aggressor. So that predominant aggressor is going to be the person who causes or poses the biggest risk in that relationship. And I can pull up the state statute if they're interested in that.
Okay. They didn't indicate in the chat, but we can probably include it in our follow-up if we would like to as well.
Perfect. That sounds great.
And then somebody's also asking if you can speak a little more about the danger assessment.
Yeah. So the danger assessment, there are different versions of the danger assessment for different groups. So there are danger assessments for immigrant women, Indigenous women, healthcare providers. There are danger assessments for same-sex relationships and judges that they can use. Typically here in Utah, what we're seeing the danger assessment used for is with our healthcare workers and our shelter systems. So advocates and healthcare workers are using the danger assessment most often in Utah. And the danger assessment assesses the level of life-threatening violence or homicide and educates survivors about their level of danger. It engages survivors in risk-informed safety planning, and it aligns the services that we're going to provide to the level of danger based off of that assessment. There are also other similar assessments to the danger assessment, like the DA5, and that's the one that's used in healthcare settings. The danger assessment is also a validated tool, and there's also the DAR, and that is used for those same-sex relationships I mentioned earlier.
There are no other questions in the chat.
Perfect. If you go to dvrisc.org, you can view the different types of risks and which one you would need to be formally trained in and things of that nature if you're interested in those.
Can you repeat that?
dvrisc.org.
Is it S or F? Sorry, that's one letter.
S as in like skulls.
Great. I think I got it right.
Cool. And I can email that over to you as well.
Okay.
All right. Let me do a quick check. If we go back to that flow chart page, we have a couple of minutes if there are any other of those bubbles that we want to look at a little more closely that we didn't get to that you wanted to see.
If you have any choice, go to the chat to do it.
I'm throwing you some curveballs today, Teresa.
We've got a couple votes for safety plans.
Safety plans, perfect. So safety plans for future. So this slide was created for they've engaged in services and their safety planning to leave. So when we look at this, if they're safety planning to leave, a few considerations. What legal documents are needed? Do they have their birth certificates, words, they're hard. Birth certificates, social security cards, their visas, things of that nature. So what legal documents do they need? And they're going to need those for themselves and any dependents that they're going to take with them. not going to be super safe to leave these documents out on the table in the shared home with the abuser or the offender. So also, where's a safe place that we can put these? We're also going to look at medical records, medications, things of that nature, especially if you are medically complex or a dependent is medically complex. These may be things that we need. Another consideration for this is who is the subscriber on the insurance plan, because if it's the offender, they're going to have access to all of those EOBs, and those are going to list out what was charged, those billing codes, which you can do a quick Google search and see what those mean. They're also going to know what provider gave those services, what date did those services take place. That's a lot of information that they may not want the offender to know or have access to. So something to keep in mind there as well. They're also going to be notifying their neighbors, friends, and family. Oftentimes when individuals are in an IPV relationship and they're leaving, the offender may stop by and say, hey, you know, I'm just looking for Katie. I'm just looking for Teresa. I haven't seen them in a few days. Haven't heard from them for a few hours. Would you just let me know if you hear from them? I'm just worried about them. And the neighbors, thinking they're being really nice and neighborly, say, oh yeah, no problem. Like Katie's gonna be home around 5 today. That's generally when she gets off work. She's gonna pick up her son and she'll be home around 5:30. They think they're being helpful. That's actually really dangerous information for them to give to someone who's looking for the victim in the relationship. So we're gonna notify neighbors, friends, and family that we've left this relationship and not to share any information if someone comes and asks for them or their schedule. We also want to notify our employers, our landlords, daycares, schools, if we have any dependent children. We also are going to probably need to give them any court documents so that if the offender shows up to pick them up from daycare or school, they can't let the child leave with them. We're going to notify or update our emergency contacts, especially if they were married and they're just leaving this relationship. We're going to update our emergency contacts, because if something were to happen, they get in a car accident or anything of that nature, their partner is probably going to be the person who's able to make those decisions. So we want to make sure emergency contacts are updated for ourselves and, again, any dependents. We're also going to safety plan with the children. This one looks a little bit different than it does when we're safety planning with the parent or guardian. So safety planning with children might look something like, who is a safe person to talk to? Who is a safe person to go with? And we want to keep this age appropriate, but we also want to be clear on what questions are safe to answer, who safe adults are, things like that. If possible, we also want to look at getting a new phone, banking, spare keys. If they can get a new phone, that's great. There are a lot of different ways that they can track people on their phones and do the electronic harassment, stalking, intrusive monitoring, things of that nature. If they have their own, if they can secure their own bank account, then they're going to have access to their own funds without risk of the offender emptying that account. Do they have the spare keys to their vehicle, to the house, things like that? Can we get the locks changed? Really easy to go make an extra key that I don't know about or a partner doesn't know about. So just trying to make sure that we have all of those keys and we can change locks if needed. So those are all things to consider when they're safety planning to leave. Keep in mind that safety planning, just because they have left, that doesn't mean that we're going to stop safety planning. As things evolve, and especially after they leave, their risk of lethality increases quite a bit. So keep in mind that that safety plan is going to continuously be evolving, and we may still be safety planning with the survivor 3 years after they left. Any questions here? Okay. So if we hit that little next button at the bottom of the flow chart, it should take us to a trauma stacking slide.
Okay.
Perfect. So now that we've kind of done a walkthrough of all of that, can we see the trauma stacking? First of all, they're surviving violence. Next, they have a lethality assessment that's been conducted. They've had police on scene. They have to determine if it's safe to answer the questions in the lethality assessment. They have to decide if it's safe to engage in decline services, their safety planning. They have law enforcement involvement, which increases their vulnerability. That also gives them, or that also is oftentimes being shown with hypervigilance that we talked about earlier. And we're increasing their risk of danger and lethality. Just because law enforcement was on scene, that's increasing their risk of lethality and danger. Then they have to defend their actions and decisions to their friends, their family, their neighbors, their law enforcement, advocates, the court. Like I said, the court of public opinion is often much harsher than the criminal justice system. They're probably going to have some increased feelings of isolation, lack of anonymity, especially if they're in a rural small town. They're probably having feelings of guilt and shame. If they have children or dependents, they're probably asking questions and trying to understand what's happening. And if they have those children or dependents, they may now have to navigate a DCFS investigation or an APS investigation, things of that nature. Or they're at least having fear that that's going to happen, that someone's going to take away their kids, someone's going to charge them. They also have that emotional or physical or other forms of retaliation from the offender if or once they're released back out into the community, potential job loss, loss of income, ability to obtain additional employment, especially if they had a DCFS case and they had that failure to protect charge that they were charged with. Now they can't pass a background check. Now they can't be a dental hygienist or a CNA or work at a family support center or a counseling center or things like that, because now they can't pass that background check. So that's something that can happen, or that they can have fear of. Then if injuries occurred and that's why law enforcement was dispatched out to the scene, now they're going to have new medical debt, and they still want the abuse to end, and they still love and care for and believe in their partner's ability to change and are trying to move in a direction to save that relationship, support family and children, improve their coping skills, minimize the violence. They want to have increased feelings of safety. But at the end of the day, there's a high likelihood that the survivors who are declining services are going to continue to experience violence at some degree. So we can see that trauma is stacking. And that's before we've ever even touched like that first court hearing, that first appearance, if charges were even filed. Just because law enforcement's on scene does not mean that charges were filed. So if the survivor does participate in that criminal justice system, then we're adding additional layers of trauma. So we have interviews, child interviews, evidence collection, meetings with advocates, meeting with prosecution, meeting with caseworkers and DCFS. We have pretrial hearings, we have trial, we have testifying, plea agreement discussion, sentencing. And that's if the case even makes it that far. Like I said, they may not file charges at all. If charges were filed, they may never make it to a sentencing hearing or a pretrial hearing. If they do make it that far, then they may experience, parole hearings, early release, Vine notifications. And I don't know if you're signed up for Vine or if you've ever looked at Vine, but when something changes with the offender while they are incarcerated, Vine's going to call you, they're going to text you, and they're going to email you. And oftentimes they're going to do that after hours. So you can't call anyone for clarification on what that means or for an update, anything of that nature, because those are coming through about 6, 7 o'clock at night. So when you're eating dinner, taking your kids out to their extracurriculars for soccer practice, football practice, whatever that may be, and you're getting those notifications again in a text, phone call, and email. And oftentimes these are like your whole life is on trial, and it's often publicized, especially in rural communities. So not only is your life on trial in an actual courtroom, but it's on trial in the court of public opinion. And then we're going to add in factors like religious beliefs, pets, ADA accessible resources, immigration, If they're limited English speaking, how well are they understanding what is happening? Are we providing translation services? Things of that nature. When we're looking at pets, like I can't just leave my house if something were to happen. I have a hobby farm, like I said earlier. I have like 25 chickens. I can't take 25 chickens to shelter. I can't take 25 chickens to my mom's house. I have cows, I have pigs, I have cats, dogs, I have a horse. Like, what am I going to do with them? Because I also can't just leave them at my house without food, water, or someone to check on them. And then emotional and mental health. Imagine navigating all of this with depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder, postpartum, things like that. Do we have access to our meds, to therapy, the healthy coping skills? How are we handling all of that? And then what's our sense of safety? That's a lot for someone to go through all at once. And if we are entering shelter stays are typically 30 to 90 days. So that's a lot in a very limited amount of time that we have to figure out. So I hope that you can see the trauma that's stacking for survivors as they're navigating this. And it helps us understand why they aren't just leaving. And if we go to this next slide, we have our window of tolerance. So the more trauma that we go through, as that trauma stacks, our window of tolerance, that blue line in the center, that's going to get smaller. Above that, we have hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is that anxiety, the racing thoughts, the panic, the overwhelm. When life is just too much, we are entering into that hyperarousal, or we can also enter into hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is when we're numb, when we're sluggish, we're withdrawn, meh, it just is what it is at this point. So there's hyperarousal and hypoarousal. There are a few things that we can do to widen that window of tolerance, to bring people back into that window of tolerance when they're experiencing hyper and hypoarousal. A couple of my favorite ones that I learned recently are if we're offering something hot and spicy or something sour, that can bring people back into that window of tolerance. So cinnamon bears, hot tamales, Sour Patch Kids, Warheads, things like that. Just a little treat. Going to kickstart us back into that window of tolerance. And I do have a sheet of different things that we can do to ground individuals, bring them back into that window of tolerance, different grounding techniques. So I'll make sure Teresa has that so that you can get that in a follow-up email. But keep in mind that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Even after all the work that we've done, I still sometimes hear, like, if they were actually a victim, they would have behaved in this way. We know trauma responses are real. We know that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. So I want you to keep that in mind. I do have a few slides here on advocates and the types of services that they provide, because there are 4 types of advocates. So we have our system-based advocate, and they're helping victims with all types of crimes, but especially with the reporting and prosecuting of those crimes. And they're going to protect victim rights throughout the criminal justice process. Their confidentiality is less legally protected because they are balancing the victim's needs with the needs of the police, lawyers, and the court. We also have our community-based advocates. If we go back to system-based, when we looked at Jane's scenario, that was a system-based advocate. So just for context there. If we look at the community-based advocate, they're typically the ones that are working in shelters. So with Jay's scenario, that would be community-based advocacy. And they're helping specific types of victims. So victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, things of that nature. They're going to help them find resources and become safer. Even if they don't use the criminal justice process, you don't have to make a report or be engaged in the criminal justice process to participate in community-based advocacy. They are legally required to have very strict confidentiality, and they're often available 24/7 through a local hotline. On our next slide, we have education-based or military-based advocates, and they are helping affiliated students or military members find resources and navigate reporting within that specific organization. These advocates are providing more confidentiality than regular faculty or military personnel who may be required to report incidents. If we look at religious-based advocacy, they are helping both victims and offenders of all types of crime with spiritual counseling and guidance. They have the highest degree of confidentiality of all advocates in a one-on-one discussion with offenders. They may be required to report incidents when reported by a victim or a third party. So those are the 4 main types of advocates. When we're looking at collaboration, keep in mind that our stats here for Utah are about 1 in 3, are 1 in 3 for women, and depending on the stats you're looking at for men, it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. But survivors are facing so much already, so much more than a single person can provide support for, resources for, and assist with. There's not one person, organization, or entity that can provide all the services that a survivor is going to need. So it's really, really important that we're collaborating. Our smallest court district in Utah has approximately 19,000 survivors in it, and our largest has almost 500,000 survivors based off of stats and population size. So it's really, really important that we are collaborating with our other partner organizations in our areas. And I know that we're at time, we're about a minute over, so I'm just going to skip down to if I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. You can all do small things in a great way and respond with trauma-informed care and keep things survivor-centered and fill those needs, those gaps. So thank you. Thank you for dealing with all of my technical difficulties, for being here today, for participating. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie. This was great. And I know we did deal with tech at the beginning, but I feel like we got it settled, which is great. So thank you everyone online for being patient with us at the beginning. In the chat, just before folks were saying thank you in there, I put the evaluation link. This will also be sent out as part of our follow-up email. So everyone will be on that. You'll get it still. So if you don't capture it now, you'll get it later. I also will be putting here in just a second. We do these sessions on the 3rd Friday of every month. Next month, we have a presentation about the Social Work Interstate Compact, about social work licensing in the state of Utah and how we are collaborating as part of this compact to be able to practice in multiple states and have a more comparative license. So feel free to register for that session if you are a social worker or if you're just interested in learning more. And the last thing, again, is thank you, Katie. And if you want to stay apprised of all of the continuing education opportunities, you can follow the Transforming Communities Institute or USU Social Work on social media. Those are the links, the QR codes to those social media pages. For the Transforming Communities Institute, we have Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We just recently got LinkedIn, but I don't have that information here, but you can search for us. And then also USU Social Work has Facebook and Instagram. So if you have any questions for Katie before we end the meeting, feel free to stay on the call. Otherwise, thank you all for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next time.